Hey everyone, it's Michael Zapersky here, and today I'm very excited to have Jonathan Fields with us. Jonathan, welcome.
Thanks. Great to be here with you.
So, Jonathan, for those who aren't familiar with you and your work, you're an author, you're a speaker, a producer, a business builder, and you're also host of the Good Life Project. You're the founder and president of Spark Endeavors, which you've been running, I believe, since 2019, if I'm not mistaken. You've been featured in lots of well-known publications and media, New York Times, CNN, Forbes, a whole bunch of others. I definitely want to dive into and kind of take this conversation down the path of how you help people deeply understand themselves and find the work that really allows them to thrive. But before we do that, let's kind of take us back to the early days. You graduated from law school. You actually worked as an attorney. Why did you leave the world of law?
Yeah, well, there's the reason I left at the time. And then there's probably a bit of a different thing if I reflect on the decision in hindsight. That was more than 2.5 decades ago at this point in my life. I graduated law school. I was very fortunate. I did well. I had opportunities. So I started my career in the Securities and Exchange Commission, like giant federal government agency, investigating insider trading. And then went out to one of the largest law firms in the world in their New York office, where I was doing securities work and IPOs and all the fancy stuff with the fancy business card and, the fancy suits and the fantastic salary and perks. And the stress of that pretty much destroyed me physically and emotionally. Within a matter of weeks, I found myself in emergency surgery when my immune system shut down after barely going home for about 3 weeks and barely sleeping, taking horrible care of myself, and working on a deal where there was no wiggle room, and we had to get it done. Literally, if we didn't get it done by a specific date, the laws in the country that we were doing the deal changed the next morning, and our client would be out of luck. So this was sort of the day-to-day life of the type of work that I was doing, and I couldn't handle the stress of it. So my immune system shut down. I ended up with a huge infection in the middle of my body that ate a hole through my intestines from the outside in. And that sent me into emergency surgery. And, when your body literally rejects your career, at some point you have to listen. And it's interesting because you asked me, kind of like, what was the decision? And how did I know it was time to leave? And back then, I had a very strong sense after that I was not long for the path of law, and that the career just wasn't right for me. I had nothing against the practice of law. I just felt like it wasn't the place for me to be. In hindsight, had I known then what I know now, especially with some of the deep dive work that we've been doing for the last 5 years, I think I might have made a different decision, to be honest with you. I think I might have had the ability to reframe that moment. And instead of saying I need to entirely leave this career in the entire industry of law, I might have looked at it and said, the way that I'm actually stepping into it is not a way that is working well for my psychology, for my physiology, for the way that I actually want to bring myself to my work in the world. But it's such a vast field, and there's so many different ways to step into it and to practice that maybe I could reimagine a different way to do it that was much more aligned with really what I need to come alive. And in hindsight, like I said, had I known then what I know now, I don't doubt that I probably would have at least tried that a whole lot more to see if I could make it work, and may well have been able to do it. But back then, I just kind of was ready to blow everything up and walk away, which is exactly what I ended up doing.
Yeah. When you kind of look back now, again, the benefit of hindsight, what do you think you may have done differently? And I'm asking because I think very often, especially when people are entering into an area that is relatively new for them, they kind of go right into the status quo. They try and kind of fit into the box and don't necessarily approach things creatively. They don't push themselves to and ask the question, like, how could I achieve the outcome that I want, but maybe in a way that better suits me as opposed to what I'm just seeing others do. So if you kind of went back to that situation, again, knowing what you know now, what may you have tried that could have got you a better result?
Yeah, well, you described something which I think is really important, which is that so many of us step into our careers sort of like trying to look for the box that seems to have the most opportunity, and then we figure out how to fit ourselves into that box. Because it's and especially when that box comes with a certain amount of prestige and a certain amount of salary, there's a large incentive to do that. And sometimes that's, how we sort of earn our chops. There are certain industries where they're sort of notorious for that, and people will do it for 2, 3, 4, 5 years and then move on. And that's what I did for sure. Rather than stepping into it and before actually understanding what to say yes or no to, I would have done some inner work myself, and I would have asked myself questions like, what type of work actually makes me come alive? What type of work empties me out? What type of work gives me the feeling of meaningfulness and purpose and allows me to drop into flow? And I don't know whether I would have been able to find the answers at the level that I could now, but I would have at least spent a lot more time on that query. And rather than looking at the market and saying, how can I fit into what's offered in the market? I would have actually done a whole bunch of detailed internal work, personal work first, or at least very early on in my path, to really understand what is the fundamental nature of work that makes me come alive, and also that empties me out, so I can do more of the former and less of the latter. Because when we do that, it gives us a sense of agency. And instead of walking around trying to figure out how we can fit into the next, like rectangular box when we're in a square box, we walk around basically having a lot of clarity about just the qualities of the work that need to be present for us to be a really strong yes. And you get lured a lot less into places and spaces and opportunities that really are not fantastic fits for you. So yeah, I would focus a lot more on the inner work and a process of self-awareness and self-discovery, which I really didn't start to focus on until much later in my career and life.
You've accomplished so much. We're going to talk about whether it's the yoga studio and different businesses and one of the top rated podcasts out there. But as you speak about this, it really makes me kind of wonder, when I look at most people who spend time doing the inner work, it almost always is the result of that they've gone through kind of like that messy middle. And I wonder, is that just part of it? I mean, is that just the way that it's supposed to be, that in order to kind of get to a place where we really need to do the inner work, we first have to go through challenging situations? Or have you found in your work that there are people who are very intentional early on? They don't actually even know where they want to go, but they spend time really digging into the inner work before they kind of set out on their path.
Yeah, it's such a great question. One that I've been asking myself and also a lot of people for a lot of years. My anecdotal evidence-based sort of answer to that would be, it's very rare for somebody to deepen into a process of self-inquiry, especially early in life, without having some sort of major disruptive moment that shakes them and drops them into the existential question. Because it's just not the way that we're sort of taught to function in life. I guess instead of saying we, which is a pretty universal term, I would probably actually say that is probably more a Western mindset. I think in Eastern mindset tends to be steeped more in holistic ideas and a different ideology and philosophy. But a Western mindset is decidedly more externally focused than internally focused. And usually the thing that brings them inside, and I'm raising my hand right here, like I don't get to carve my life or myself out of this, is something big happens that makes you ask that big question. I mean, we're seeing it right now, the last 18 months, the volume of people who've been dropped into a state of profound disruption and now find themselves as a result of that asking the big existential questions that they had literally never asked for the last 10, 20, 30, 40 working years of their lives, is leading people at a scale that we've never seen before to re-examine the bargain that they made when they started their career and ask themselves, is that the bargain that I want to continue to make for the rest of my working life? And for a lot of them, the answer is no.
Yeah. This is deep stuff. I want to come back to this because we could just kind of keep going, peeling the layers of the onion back there. But I want to touch on a few other things that really stand out to me. Around 2000s, I believe, early 2000s or so, you started Sonic Yoga, New York City. You later sold that, I believe, in 2008. Why did you get into the yoga business? And was that what you did right after you left the kind of the world of law, or was there something else that happened in between?
Yeah, there was an in between, but it was all part of the same thread. I've had a lifelong fascination with just the human potential, and also mind body connection and wellness, and entrepreneurship. I was a lemonade stand kid. I was a gymnast as a kid, a competitive gymnast, and I was always fascinated by how we rise into our potential and
Mm,
how our bodies and minds connect to do that. And I walked away from that when I was practicing law entirely, both in the context of my own life and also just in terms of the fascination. And I knew when I left law that I wanted to go back into the world of entrepreneurship, and in well-being and human potential. And I also knew I was going to take a huge hit. So my first job out of law was making $12 an hour as a personal trainer, just learning the ropes of the fitness industry. I could have very likely talked my way into a management level position, but I thought it was really important for me to understand what is the social dynamic, what is the actual human interaction that happens at the fundamental point of contact in this industry, what's going right and what's going wrong, so that I could understand how to create a better mousetrap. I did that for about 6 months until I really got a pretty good beat on what I wanted to do. And then opened my first fitness facility, which I grew for about 2.5 years before selling to an investor group. And then I got pretty curious about the world of yoga along the way. I had started to develop my own practice, in no small part incited by an interest in breathing exercises, or in the yoga world, what they call pranayama, when I
mm,
was wrapping up my legal career, because I was so freaked out by the adversarial nature of what I was doing. I needed to find a way to just very quickly downregulate my system, and breathing is a really powerful way to do that. That eventually led to a fascination in yoga. And after I sold the fitness facility, it took a little bit of time, was living in Hell's Kitchen, New York. And then I ended up signing a 6-year lease for a floor in a building, to create what I hoped would become one of the premier yoga centers in New York City. I was married, I had a 3-month-old baby, a new home. And the date that I signed that lease was September 10th, 2011, which was the day before 9/11 in New York City. Um, Woke up that next day and to, the absolute worst thing imaginable. There were people that we knew that didn't come home. And at the same time, we were mourning that and dealing with that and dealing with a city that was destroyed. Um, and I was asking myself, am I really going to launch a new venture into this environment? And that moment was pretty pivotal for me, because it really brought me back to the essential truth that we have one pass through this thing called life. And the vast majority of our waking hours are going to be spent doing this thing we call work. And to the extent that we can make that thing more nourishing, more meaningful, more purpose driven, more exciting and energizing, then I wanted to figure out how to do that, how to be part of it. So
mm.
we went ahead and opened that business, which became this beautiful, flourishing international community of people. And it was a really powerful moment. So it started really with a fascination with this new space for me, my next entrepreneurial venture. I had no business teaching when I started out, even though I sort of cobbled together enough knowledge to do it, and eventually, trained to be proficient at it. But it was it was the next evolution for me, and it was also something that allowed me to dive deeply into Eastern philosophy and spirituality and teachings, like whether it's Hinduism and Sanskrit and Buddhism, and understand just a completely different frame on what's valuable in life, and how to step into the way that we meet each day and the people in our lives. So it was something that I actually consider to this day, even though I haven't taught physical yoga classes, asana, for more than 13 years, I feel still very much like the work that I'm doing today is yoga, but in a different context.
When you were at that point, September 11th, do you move forward with this? Do you not move forward with this? And it doesn't have to necessarily be like that exact moment in time, but around that period when you decide to move forward with that business, what was the biggest challenge that you faced?
Um, Probably
Like,
my own fear.
was there anything so strong that I actually had you thinking maybe I should not move forward with this?
Oh yeah, I mean, every fiber in my being was questioning whether I should move forward with it. I was living in a city that was financially devastated, that was emotionally and psychologically devastated, that was literally physically devastated. I had a 3-month-old baby.
Mhm.
And starting a new venture in the best of times is very risky. I was married, I had a new home, so there was a lot riding on this. So there were like way more reasons to be fearful and way
Mhm.
more reasons to shut it down than there were to move forward. But it was that realization that we were in a moment in time where there was never a greater need for a place for community and healing and movement and breath and just a place to be, coupled with that realization that I knew somebody who was in the top of one of those towers with 2 young kids and a wife and a beautiful home who never came home, and we're not guaranteed
Yeah.
anything. And I just felt like this was the thing that I needed to do. So was I scared? Yeah, I was terrified. But I was more scared of not doing it than I was
Yeah.
doing it.
I want to just transition that or bend that conversation or that point a little bit to the world of consulting. So often consultants, hesitate to get in front of ideal clients. Like they need to, whether it's launching their business or launching some new aspect or some new campaign, they have all kinds of voices in their mind telling why they shouldn't do that. They, don't interrupt people, don't promote yourself, don't bother. All these different things going on. Maybe I'm not good enough. I should wait until I do this, do that. Based on your experience of building multiple businesses, working towards mastering mindset, or maybe have mastered many aspects of mindset. What encouragement or what suggestions would you have to somebody who's listening right now who knows they need to do something? They feel the calling, but they're not taking action. Something's holding them back. What advice might you offer them?
Yeah, and trust me, I get that in a very visceral way. I mean, like I sold at the yoga center at the end of 2008, and since then have been doing a combination of media production, running 2 different companies, speaking, writing, and consulting. I've worked with everyone from startups to individuals to professionals to global enterprises with 250,000 employees in them. So I get it. I get how terrifying it can be to put yourself out there, to create new offerings, new products, new services. Um, and when you think about like the big thing, for most people, it's terrifying. And one of the things that I found is super effective, not just for me, but really for everybody, is that if we take that thing that we're talking about creating, maybe it's a new product or offering, maybe it's like a new pitch for something, um, rather than thinking about, like, how am I going to build this whole big thing and how I'm going to prove that it's viable and worthy? I mean, I'm in that place right now with an entirely new body of work in the market. Um, and nobody's going to take me seriously, and I'm going to be destroyed if I go out there in a big way and people laugh me out of the room. Rather than do that, and by the way, all of that has to be on the table, because if there's no risk at all, um, that means that you're not doing anything new.
Mm,
And if you're not doing anything new, why are we here?
right.
If like, I'm not here to replicate the lives and the work of other people. I'm here because I want to push the envelope of what's happening. So you should feel that. And if you don't ever feel that, it tends to be a sign that complacency is setting in. And if you're cool with that and your business keeps rocking, that's fine. But what I've seen for the most part is when we hit that point, there's no sideways. The illusion of just coasting and riding it out and everything being okay is just that. It's an illusion. Life applies friction, and eventually things will start to grind and slow. So it's part of our job to actually continue to lean into the process of ideation, innovation, or else, we're going to slowly become obsolete. So I've been in that place. I get it viscerally. And what I found works really, really well for me is to create a really clear picture of what you would love to see happen. Create that big picture, that vision, that thing you want to create, or that big thing you want to offer. Um, and then chunk it down into the steps that'll take to get there. So like, what 50 or 75 or 100 steps or actions will I need to take to actually get to that place, to make that happen, or else to get it to a place where, there's at least the possibility of it happening at the scale that I imagine. And a lot of people do that. But then there's one other thing that is pretty transformational, which is you don't just chunk the steps, you chunk the stakes. The thing that freaks us out is not the amount of work it'll take to pull it off, we're pretty comfortable working hard. It's a safe bet. People who are watching, listening to this, they work hard, right?
Mhm.
So the thing that freaks us out and shuts us down and causes fear is not the level of work. We're not afraid that we're going to work really hard and it's not going to work. We are afraid that we're going to work really hard, put something out into the world, and it's going to be rejected. And then we're going to be laughed out of the room. We're going to be outcast. We're going to be discredited. And the stakes of that, we feel, are career ending potentially. So what if instead you took the stakes of putting this big new thing out into the world, or a new offering, or to a single client who's really big, and chunk those stakes down? So like, what's the first step forward where the stakes are so low that it's almost impossible for your brain to say, this is too terrifying to at least take this tiny little action.
Mhm.
So you take the big stakes and you're like, what is the smallest thing that I can do where the stakes are also really low? And just take that first step. So hold the ultimate vision out there, like know what it is. And then just take this tiny little step where the action is small and the stakes are low, and see how it feels. And then if it feels okay, take the next step where the stakes are also chunked into a smaller little thing. What you'll find is over time, the fear of taking those tiny little steps, like small steps, low stakes, fear tends to diminish, tends to almost completely go away when you approach it that way. And what happens over time is with every step, then your progress towards that ultimate goal tends to prove the viability of the thing that you fear not being viable, or not. Or you'll get, like 15 steps into 100 steps, and you'll start to realize that you're getting feedback and you're getting data, and it's actually disproving the assumptions you had about this thing being valuable and viable, which is
Mhm.
really awesome, because it's better to know that early on than down the road when you've spent, a year developing it and then roll it out to the world, and then it's, soundly rejected and it doesn't work. So, so the fear side, I totally get, and I live with that on a persistent basis. Um, but when you approach it by creating a really clear picture of that big thing that you would love to make happen, and then chunk the steps and the stakes, um, the, it pretty much eliminates most of that problem, to be honest with you.
Yeah, that stakes part is definitely a really interesting and unique perspective that I haven't really heard before. So I appreciate you sharing that. I want to wander down the path together to the word fulfillment. A lot of
Mm.
the work you do is helping people to become more fulfilled. Uh, how do you first of all define that? Like, what does fulfillment actually look like to you?
Um, so fulfillment to me, and it's a really nebulous word. The equivalent word that I probably use or phrase is coming alive. Like I feel like I've come alive, or I'm alive, or
Mm,
sparked. Sparked is really the shorthand that I've reverted to. And when I think about that, so I could answer that question two ways, actually. I could answer it in the context of work, or I could answer it in the context of life.
mm,
I think there's a lot of overlap, but they're not necessarily the same.
yeah.
I think when a lot of us think about the context of work, we think about security and status and prestige and quote success, defined by the outside world. Um, when I think about it in the context of work, like, how do I feel when I feel like I'm just, my body is alive and I'm completely and utterly content with what I'm doing? you know um and there tend to be five components of that state for me. One is meaningfulness. I feel like what I'm doing actually is meaningful to me, that it matters. um I feel like I'm energized and excited to do that work. That's a big part of being fulfilled or satisfied or really
Mhm.
alive for me. I feel like um I can dip into a well of my potential that doesn't always feel available to me, and feel like I'm showing up as my best self and performing at my highest possible level. There's nothing being held back, and there's nothing being stifled or that I can't actually access and tap into. It's all just tumbling out there into the effort. I feel like I can access that flow state where, I become absorbed in the nature of the activity or the conversation or the relationship, the pursuit, and time flies. I blink and I think I've worked an hour and it's been 12 hours, and a broader sense of purpose in life. That I know that I'm working towards something that I care about, and that there's a sense that I'm doing the thing that I'm here to do. So
Mm.
to me, when I think about, you know, like you use the word fulfilled, I use the phrase coming alive or sparked. And to me, there are 5 components of that. And those are the 5 components. And if you drew a Venn diagram, the overlap, you know, of meaningfulness, flow, excitement and energy, expressed potential and purpose, that's the state that I aspire to in the context of work. Um, and you can get all of those things, by the way, in your work if you're really
Mhm.
intentional about it. But also, I think it's important to note that work is not the only way to get those. Like, there's a huge amount of meaning that I derive from being a dad and a husband and a son and a brother and a friend. You know, so there are different ways to access those different components more broadly in life as well, which is why I kind of made that distinction.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. I've often talked about at the apex of a triangle. Many people will put their business right at the top. They'll make all kinds of decisions, and then they put their lifestyle or kind of, life below that, and have to make sacrifices in their lifestyle to support their business. And I'm a very big believer that we should be putting our lifestyle at the apex and get very clear about like what does a meaningful life look like? What does success look like? And then put the business below it so that you can structure the business to support the lifestyle that you want. Your brand, or one of your brands, right? The Good Life Project is about creating that good life. Are there any strategies in addition to what you just shared around the kind of the 5 different maybe spark types or the 5 different kind of components there, but is there anything else that you've found helpful in your journey as an entrepreneur, at consultant as well, to strike that right balance where we can make sure that our lifestyle and the meaning and the success, is supported with business? Just any thoughts you have around like how to move through that or think through that strategically so that those two really work well together?
Yeah. So there's a meta skill that I think, in my mind, it would be amazing if everybody cultivated. Everything that we're talking about, is a matter of being intentional, right? We
Mhm.
can't actually do any of these things. We can't devote ourselves to saying yes to things that are meaningful, no to things that aren't, or, it's all about being intentional, making intentional choices. But here's the thing: you can't be intentional unless and until you're aware. And that's self-aware and also externally aware. You've got to be aware of your own inner world, your own inner experience and thoughts and feelings, but you've also got to be more aware of what's actually happening around you, not just the facade or the illusion or the subjective overlay, which tends to involve massive amounts of bias that we bring to certain circumstances. But we want to be as clear and aware as humanly possible, because if we're not aware, we don't have the ability to be intentional,
Mhm.
even if we think we're being intentional. So how do you cultivate awareness? Well, for me, the power skill, the power practice, which has been a essential part of my life for well over a decade now, is mindfulness. And that shows up in 2 ways. It shows up as a daily sitting practice. Every morning I roll out of bed, and my day starts with a sitting mindfulness practice and breathing practice. And that really centers and grounds me, in my breath, in my body. And it also, because of mindfulness practice in particular, which is a type of meditative practice, part of what it trains you to do is see where your thoughts are going and then drop thoughts. And if you want to talk about how to deal with fear or anxiety or spin, you can't deal with any of that until you actually are aware of the fact that you're anxious, or aware of the fact that you've got destructive thoughts spinning in your
Right.
head. And this particular practice, mindfulness, it trains you thousands of times over and over and over to check in and say, like, ooh, thinking, what was thinking? Let me let that go. And then 5 seconds later, you're back to the same thing, but it gives you the skill to zoom the lens out. It gives you meta attention, where you can almost like you're out behind you and looking down into your head and you're noticing what's happening.
Right.
So it's incredibly powerful. And it also, more persistently over time, it allows you to see more clearly what's really going on, both in your internal responses to circumstances and situations, and also what's actually happening around you.
Mm.
So you'll have a lot more clarity around social dynamics in a room. And it gives you the ability to be less reactive and more responsive and intentional in the way that you both treat yourself and the way that you treat others. It also allows you to deal with high levels of uncertainty where the stakes are high, with much more equanimity.
Mhm.
And that has been game changing for me, like as a consultant, as an entrepreneur, as a founder. as a dad, as a human being on the planet who's living in times where, there's a whole lot of groundlessness and the stakes are sometimes life and death. That practice to me has been really transformative in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's really powerful to hear. I'd love to learn more about that. I don't have a mindfulness practice, but a couple of years ago, I started paying more attention to uh, the thoughts that were running through my mind, specifically when I got excited about something, as well
Mm.
as even more so the opposite, when all of a sudden I started to feel a bit of not sadness, but like a negative emotion, kind of a wave of negative emotion would come across my mind, and oftentimes I wouldn't know what would happen, and that would then carry over to how I'd interact with my wife or my kids or team members. And so I started really thinking, like, where's this coming from? And so I would stop myself and I'd go, why am I having this negative emotion? And I then recognize, or I'd kind of walk backwards and go, oh, you just read an email without even consciously like understanding what you just did. You just read an email, and something in that email made you upset. And the more that I become conscious of that, I found that I have fewer of those because I've almost trained my mind to deal with negative things or just events that I'm not even anticipating would come my way. So it sounds like there's a bit of that in the mindfulness, but a whole lot more. But definitely something for me to look more into.
Yeah. And honestly, what you described is very similar to a mindfulness practice. It maybe just be like, this is kind of like the way that you actually engaged in a mindful way with your thoughts and feelings, which is really all it is.
Yeah.
There are a lot of different ways you can sit, you can follow your breath, all these different things. But what you described is actually very much a mindfulness practice.
Yeah. I mean, I highly encourage everybody to look into this, because it's a game changer when sometimes we're not even in control of ourselves, of our own thoughts, right? We have an emotion that takes over how we interpret things, then that translates into how we interact with others. And so just kind of getting control of yourself, I found, has been very helpful for me. I want to talk about your new book, Sparked. You have Spark Types, right? Which is a program that you've developed to help people discover their unique imprint for the work that makes them come alive. And what I'd love if you could do, Jonathan, is kind of like walk us through high level the development of this. Where did this idea begin? Was the book first? Was the assessment first? You have a kind of an accreditation training program. I'd love to get I think be very interesting for others, for everyone, to kind of hear, how did you go from the seed of an idea to the development of a whole kind of suite of different offerings connected to that core idea?
Yeah, I'm happy to share that process. And I think it is because I think so many people are in the space of consulting or coaching or mentoring in some meaningful way. We have so many ideas spinning in our heads, and often they, over time, through interaction with people, we're testing and validating, and they turn into a methodology, but we don't even realize that they're actually a
Mm,
defined methodology or a defined, a set of intellectual property or body of work. So we never really map them out and build them out as this identifiable thing, and then offer them to the world in a way where there's something really distinct. We're perceived as being able to actually offer something very different. So the process for me started with, as it generally does, a burning question, and it really goes all the way back to that moment I described back after 9/11, where I've just had this deep fascination with how we spend our lives, and in particular, our working lives. And over the years, what I realized, I developed a lot of systems and process to help entrepreneurs and founders and people who are early in business try and develop more conscious businesses that didn't just serve a market need. It wasn't just about product market fit. It was also about what I call product maker fit. It was, you wanted to actually do something for you. And people had started asking me this question. They kept saying, like, what should I do with my life? But when they were asking me, what they were really asking was, how do I find and do work that makes me come alive? And when I use that phrase, come alive, it's those 5 components that I described earlier.
right.
And I realized that, there was a lot of there's been a lot written about this question. There's lot written about purpose, and there's a lot written about meaning and work. There's a lot of spiritual practice and ideology around it. There's a lot of academic research, a lot of it coming from the world of social science and applied positive psychology. And I was pretty deep into all of those worlds, but I didn't see a whole lot of just practical guidance. I saw a lot of really fantastic and interesting indexes and tools, Many of us have used them before that answer a lot of different questions. They're more generalized personality traits,
Mhm.
relational styles, all sorts of things like that. But I didn't see something that really spoke to this question of like, how do we identify on the most basic level, the fundamental impulse for work that makes us come alive so that we can do more of it? And then I began to wonder, are there actually an identifiable, mappable set of impulses or imprints for work that gives us that feeling? Because if there was, and I could identify them and then build tools that would help elicit them from people fairly quickly, that would be incredibly valuable, not, on two levels. One, for the individual, because you'd have so much more agency and freedom to understand how to show up and align yourself with work that really gives you that feeling. But also in the context of organizations and leadership and
Mhm.
engagement, you would understand how to effectively remove friction and dramatically decrease the need for extrinsic motivation, which we know doesn't work past like the first three heartbeats anyway. um, so I started deepening into this question, literally looking at like every job and every list imaginable and deconstructing what are the fundamental ways that people exert themselves in the context of these different things. And I was, to be honest, pretty shocked. It distilled down very quickly to 10 fundamental impulses for effort. I had no idea if I would ever get to anything. And I didn't know if it would be, like 12 or 1,000. It distilled down to 10. And that number kind of bugs me because it feels way too slick. But that is where we've landed for now. The scientist side of me always holds open the possibility that with further research, we'll identify some different things, but that's where we've landed at this point. Once I found those fundamental impulses, I started to realize that each one of them also tends to have its own kind of quirky set of behaviors and tendencies and preferences that wrap around those impulses. So a person who has that impulse tends to also move into the world in peculiar and particular ways that are unique to them. And those formed archetypes. And I started calling those sparketypes, literally just because it was a really fun way to sort of say like the archetype for work that sparks you. And it caught. And I started sharing them around and asking people about them. And I was getting tremendous feedback, but I wanted more feedback at scale.
Mhm.
So we spent most of 2018 developing an assessment to try and see if we could do two things. One, validate or invalidate these ideas at scale. And two, build a tool that if it went out into the world and we were getting strong feedback and validation, it would be really helpful. It would allow people to understand what their imprint or sparketype was fairly quickly. So we released that out of beta at the end of 2018. Since then, we've had, I think we're between 550,000 and 600,000 people have completed the assessment now. So we're
And
sitting
how,
on,
sorry to interrupt, Jonathan. I just want to
yeah.
clarify, because to some people that number is going to be like mind blowing, right? How have you gone about getting that many people to take the assessment?
Yeah, so it's a combination of a lot of different things. I came into that having a pretty substantial personal platform from the world of media because I've been producing a podcast and been very fortunate that it's a large podcast with a big audience. So I was able to sort of like seed the initial audience in no small part through that. Then one of the things that we learned is because it is to a certain extent an identity focused assessment, when people discover something that is that fundamental about themselves, they share it. So
Mhm.
there's been a tremendous amount of sharing around it as well. So once we get to that point, I start realizing there's something much bigger happening here. And then when the numbers start to get that big, um, then all of a sudden you get stories and stories and stories and use cases and applications. Then I start to take these ideas into companies in a very kind of like soft way, starting with maybe a friend I know who's an L&D in a like small company and say, hey, can I come and do a lunch and learn? Which is as much for me to learn
Right.
and get feedback on these things as to, like provide value. So in these sort of like low stakes ways that I was talking about before, it's not a huge deal if there are 6 people in a room and we're bouncing ideas. Um, and the feedback was really good. And I kept developing the ideas. And it just get more and more robust, where eventually I start talking to larger organizations. And then all of a sudden, I find myself sitting down for a part-day workshop with the ELT of a giant global enterprise, sharing these ideas. And then they invite me in because the ideas resonate so much that they want all their senior leaders to be exposed to these ideas.
I just want to jump in for one sec. Sorry to interrupt again, but when you're approaching all these people, from what you've said, I mean, is there an intention to run like a paid workshop or put people through a paid program, or is the initial outreach and kind of approach really just focused on, like, I'd love to get some ideas from you, share this with you, because I think that I'm getting one sense from you. I just want to confirm, like, what's your mindset approach when you're going into those conversations?
Yeah. So if I'm being honest, like a couple of years, by the time I started having those conversations, I had a pretty strong sense that we had created something that was valuable, because everybody, all the feedback was like, listen, we've taken literally every assessment on the planet. And there's a lot of really good ones, and they tell us a lot of stuff. And some of the organizations had built their own internal ones. They're like,
Right.
This is telling us something different. This is adding a different piece of information, and it's valuable to us. So when I would go, sort of like to the next level of organizations, at that point, it was really probably twofold. Like, I'm going in because I want to continue to get feedback and develop the ideas for sure. And also in the back of my mind, I'm starting to think, this is something bigger. We started this under the umbrella of my existing company and brand, Good Life Project, because I didn't know how anyone would respond to it when we first launched it. And I didn't want to build anything I didn't have to. Once we saw what the response was, I think it was 2019, we split it into its own company, which is fundamentally, a training organization. It's a research and development and training organization to deepen into these ideas and then share them with the world. And, at that point, then the idea is, in part, let's keep developing this and getting feedback. And then let's develop programming around it that would help figure out how this gets deployed, both for individuals and also within organizations. Like, where does it make most sense for people to use these tools and ideas?
Mm-hmm.
So it was a sort of like a slow evolutionary process, but at a certain point, for sure, part of it became, okay, so let's actually start to build revenue, both programming and revenue centers around this. So when I show up and speak at an organization, I get a keynote fee for that, or or a half day or a full day fee for that. As we have other people that are, we're training up in the IP and send them out into the world, we're building something bigger. So now, the engagements basically all serve a dual purpose. They continue to let us learn as we apply the work, but also when we show up, we expect to get paid now,
Right.
because we know that we have something that's of value, and that's been reflected to us enough times that to not do that is basically, it takes too much time and energy away from the organization. And there's another thing, and I think might be valuable for consultants in general when you think about how you're like stepping into work, which is that, there is a classic psychology in the marketplace, especially with organizations and the world of consulting, which is that price implies quality. And if you're showing up and giving everything away or charging really below market rates, the perception is there's a reason for that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I show up and I charge my full keynote rate or my full, half day rate, or for certifications, we charge, like what I feel is a very fair rate, but it is not positioned as free or as, an entry level engagement in the marketplace. And I think it's important because sometimes we can be scared to step in and do that because, there's all sorts of fear around being judged, not being accepted, people thinking you're overcharging. I was taught from the very early days of business, you never price the way that you sell things on an hourly basis or things like that. It's all value-based pricing is the way that I approach things. It's like, you have a problem, I can solve it. What is the economic value of the pain caused by that problem? If I can help you solve that problem, at a fraction of what the economic pain is monetized at, and that is still a substantial amount of revenue that comes into my organization, then we're both really happy.
Yeah. Why
Um,
did you decide to, I mean, there's two kind of schools of thought around, you develop this methodology, you have this approach, you could build a team or even just be you, Jonathan Fields, going out, giving the keynotes, doing the one-day workshops, whatever it might be. And that's just the business, and grow it that way. Where it seems to me you've been very intentional in, yes, you're doing that, but you're also transitioning actively to building up a team of others who can be accredited, kind of trained on this methodology and approach, and have them go out into the world. Why take that path? Where did that kind of decision come into play?
yeah. And we're actually, full disclosure, we're in the middle of making those decisions literally as I'm having this conversation with
Okay.
you, because the body of work and the reception is moving so quickly now, especially, we're having this conversation literally, like days after my book came out, which has sort of exploded the volume of attention to, towards the body of work. And we're in the middle of that question a lot right now. So, we have had strong interest in some sort of training or accreditation in how to actually work with these ideas and these tools for a long time, in no small part because we've been getting a lot of messages for a couple of years now from everyone from coaches and consultants to L&D pros and HR pros saying, hey, we're using this work with our clients and our orgs. And then everyone's asking us all these questions and we're not entirely sure how to answer them.
Right. Yeah.
So we're like, okay, so we need to actually step into that marketplace with some really intelligent training
Right.
that helps people really understand how to work with the body of work and the tools in a way that is constructive and not destructive. um, and I care deeply
Yeah.
about how that happens. So rather than, at this point, rather than just saying basically, hey, we're doing a certification program and anybody who shows up and pays the tuition is certified. We're not, that is not our model at all. I care deeply about who we sort of allow to carry this work forward. So there's a selection process and an application process. And even after you do the initial training, there's an applied part of it. And we want to actually see how you're working with these tools and ideas in the marketplace before we actually say, okay, so we're taking our time with it, is the honest answer. And if we feel like we actually do want, at the end of the day, a lot more control, then we may focus more heavily on building up our team internally or partnering with an existing training organization or someone else
Right.
who will help us scale in a really intelligent way. But fundamentally underneath it for me, it feels like the world is reflecting back that there's some value in what we've developed. And to the extent that, whether it's the book, whether it's the assessment, which is completely free and gated, which is a little bit unusual in the business world. I want these ideas to go out into the world and for people to interact with them. And because if they can help people step into a place of more meaning in their lives, especially now,
Yeah.
we need that more than ever.
So in just a moment, I'm gonna have you share where people should go to learn more about the book, about the assessment, everything that you have going on. Before that, one question that I like to ask guests at the end is, and especially this is, I think, a good one for you because you are well studied and well read. Last 6 months, top book, either fiction or nonfiction, that you really enjoyed.
Mm. I read so many books, especially for the podcast, because I interview so many authors. I really enjoyed Adam Grant's Think Again, actually. In sort of like the nonfiction world. I'm a huge fan of not getting locked into positions. I try and really hold myself open and test my assumptions on a regular basis. And his whole philosophy of spend more time rethinking than thinking really resonates with me.
Fantastic. We'll have that linked up as well. So let us know, where should people go, Jonathan, to learn more about your new book, about the assessment and everything else you have going on?
Yeah, so you can actually take the assessment. It's completely free and available online at sparketype.com. That's SPARKETYPE.com. You'll find the book there too. And the book is available just at booksellers really everywhere in the world. And if you want to listen to the podcast, it's Good Life Project on whatever your favorite listening app is.
There we go. Jonathan, thanks so much for hanging out today. Really appreciate it and enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks so much.